I never imagined that grief could be this heavy, that the world could keep turning while my heart felt like it had been crushed into glass shards and scattered into the wind. My husband's funeral was supposed to be the darkest day of my life, but nothing could have prepared me for the truth that came afterward, a truth so vile and twisted that it made my grief feel almost small compared to the rage it ignited inside me. The church was full of people dressed in black, some weeping quietly, others whispering, and I sat there, staring at the casket, unable to believe that the man I had loved for more than a decade was gone. He was supposed to grow old with me, he was supposed to watch me turn gray and wrinkled, and we were supposed to laugh at our grandkids one day. Instead, I was clutching a damp tissue, my hands trembling, trying to figure out how to keep breathing when my other half was lowered into the ground. I remember the way my sister sat beside me, placing her hand on my shoulder like she cared. She leaned close, her perfume filling my nose, and whispered things like, "Stay strong," and "You're not alone." For that moment, I thought she was being a sister, my sister, the girl I had grown up sharing secrets and clothes with, the one who had stood beside me through the highs and lows of my life. But what I didn't know was that her hand was heavy with a secret, one so monstrous it made me want to scream when it finally came out. Because when the funeral ended and people began to trickle away, she stayed behind, her face pale but her eyes shining with something strange, almost like satisfaction. And then she said words that still echo in my skull like a curse, "My son is your husband's child." At first, I laughed, not because it was funny but because my brain couldn't process what she had just said. I thought maybe grief was playing tricks on me, that I had misheard her, that maybe she was saying something poetic about how close we had all been as a family. But then she pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse, her hands shaking just enough to make me realize this wasn't some weird metaphor. She handed it to me, and I unfolded it, only to see my husband's handwriting at the bottom of what looked like a will. My heart stopped. The will was dated only 6 months before his death, and it stated that a significant portion of his assets were to go to her son, my nephew. I dropped the paper like it had burned me and stared at her, my whole body going cold. She didn't look guilty. That was the part that hurt most. She looked smug, like she had been holding this card in her hand for years and finally had the chance to play it. She told me in the calmest voice I had ever heard that she and my husband had been together for years behind my back, that her son was proof of their love, and that he had always promised her he would take care of them both. She didn't apologize, she didn't cry, she gloated. And I sat there, frozen, my grief turning into something sharp and dangerous inside me. I wanted to scream at her, to rip her smug face apart, but all I could do was sit there in shock as the walls of my life crumbled around me. For weeks after the funeral, I wandered the house like a ghost. Every photo of me and my husband mocked me, every memory of us felt like a lie. My family, our family, looked at me with pity in their eyes when they heard the rumors my sister had spread, because of course she told everyone. She told them she was his real love, that I had been nothing more than a placeholder. People whispered behind my back, and I became the subject of public mockery in my own community. Women who had once been my friends stopped calling, stopped visiting, because they didn't want to be associated with the fool who couldn't even keep her husband loyal, the woman who got replaced by her own sister. But what they didn't know was that beneath my quiet, broken exterior, something inside me was hardening. Rage. Determination. A thirst for revenge that began as a spark and grew into a wildfire. I started digging. If my husband had left a will, then there were lawyers involved, and lawyers kept records. I requested copies, I examined every detail, and slowly, I began to see cracks in her story. Yes, there was a will, but the circumstances around it were suspicious. He had been sick when it was signed, barely coherent some days, and my sister had been the one who insisted on handling his appointments. That alone made my blood boil. Then I went deeper. I hired someone to look into the paternity of her son, because if what she said was true, then at least DNA would confirm it. Weeks later, the results came back, and my world twisted again, but this time in my favor. Her son wasn't my husband's child. He was someone else's, a man she had dated briefly before her marriage fell apart. My husband had raised him in secret, had supported him financially, but he wasn't the father. The DNA test proved it, and I felt like I could breathe again. But instead of confronting her immediately, I decided to play the long game. She wanted to humiliate me publicly. Then I would destroy her publicly. I gathered evidence, emails, letters, proof of her manipulations, proof of how she had coerced my sick husband into signing things he barely understood. I built a case piece by piece, all while pretending to be broken and defeated. I let her think she had won, that I had accepted her twisted version of reality. She flaunted her supposed victory, walking around town with her head high, while I was quietly preparing her downfall. The day came when the will was to be settled in court, and my sister strutted in like a queen, her son by her side, convinced they were about to inherit what she thought was hers. But when my lawyer stood up and presented the DNA evidence, the forged medical records, and the clear proof of manipulation, her face finally cracked. The smug mask shattered into panic. The judge saw it for what it was: fraud, coercion, and deception. The will was deemed invalid, and everything reverted to the original version, where I was the sole heir, the rightful widow, and the only person my husband had legally entrusted with his life's work. But that wasn't enough for me. The revenge wasn't complete yet. I turned to her son, who had been used like a pawn in her sick game, and I told him the truth about who his real father was. I told him how his mother had manipulated him his entire life, filling his head with lies, making him believe he was the product of some tragic love story. The look on his face broke my heart, but it was necessary. He deserved the truth, and she deserved to lose the one person she thought she still controlled. In the end, she was left with nothing. No inheritance, no reputation, no son who trusted her. I stood tall, not because I had wanted to win, but because I refused to be destroyed by her betrayal. I rebuilt my life slowly, piece by piece, and I made sure the world knew the truth. People who had mocked me came crawling back with apologies, but I never forgot the way they had laughed at me when I was at my lowest. My sister thought she had buried me along with my husband, but instead, she planted the seed of my vengeance. And when it bloomed, it consumed everything she had. That's the thing about betrayal: it can break you, or it can build you into something unshakable. And when I stood there in that courtroom, watching my sister's lies unravel, I realized something powerful. She had tried to steal my life, my dignity, and my love, but in the end, all she gave me was a reason to rise higher than I ever had before. And I did. I rose from the ashes of my grief, and I turned her greatest weapon into her ultimate downfall. After the court hearing, when the will had been overturned and my sister had been exposed, you would think I would feel free, finally able to breathe without the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. But the truth is, freedom after devastation doesn't come all at once. It comes in little waves, moments where the silence in the house doesn't feel so suffocating, moments where I can look at his photograph and smile instead of sobbing until my throat burns. Still, the shadow of what my sister had done lingered over me like a storm cloud that refused to leave. People in town began whispering again, but this time the whispers weren't mocking, they were heavy with shame for the way they had treated me. Suddenly I wasn't the fool anymore. I was the wronged woman, the widow who had carried herself with grace while her own blood tried to rob her blind. They spoke kindly to me in grocery stores, at church, in passing, but it all felt hollow. Where were they when I sat alone after the funeral, drowning in tears and humiliation? Where were they when my sister spread her poison and everyone chose to believe her lies? I learned quickly that pity isn't much better than mockery. They didn't admire me for surviving, they pitied me for having lived through it all. And I decided that pity was something I would never accept again. I wanted respect, I wanted strength, and I wanted to rebuild my life on my own terms, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the woman who had taken that betrayal and turned it into power. But my sister wasn't done. She couldn't stand the fact that her scheme had collapsed in front of everyone. She began spreading new lies, saying the court system was rigged, that I had faked the DNA test, that I had tricked everyone. She walked around like a storm, trying to gather sympathy for herself, playing the victim when she had been the predator all along. At first, it made me furious. I wanted to scream at everyone, to show them the truth again and again, but then I realized something: she was digging her own grave. The more she tried to defend herself with outrageous lies, the less people believed her. The woman who had once looked so smug was now seen as desperate, delusional, and pathetic. Her son, my nephew, stopped speaking to her altogether. He came to me once, trembling with anger and confusion, holding the DNA test results in his hands. He asked me if it was true, if the man he had called uncle was never his father at all. I nodded, tears in my eyes, and told him the truth, the whole truth, because he deserved at least that. I told him my husband had cared for him, had supported him, but that didn't mean biology tied them together. And in that moment, I saw the weight of betrayal fall onto his young shoulders, the same betrayal I had felt when I learned the truth. He wasn't just betrayed by her lies, he was betrayed by the fantasies she had built his whole life upon. For weeks, he stayed with me, avoiding her, refusing her calls. I cooked for him, comforted him, and listened as he poured out his anger. In some strange way, he and I became closer than ever before, united not by blood but by pain. And slowly, I realized that maybe my revenge wasn't just about exposing her lies, it was also about showing him that her poison didn't have to define him, that he could break free from it and choose his own path. But my sister couldn't stand being ignored. She showed up at my house one evening, pounding on the door, her face twisted with fury. When I opened the door, she didn't even bother pretending anymore. She screamed at me, accused me of stealing her son, stealing her life, destroying everything she had. She spat words so venomous that for a moment, I wondered if she even remembered we were sisters, if there was ever a time we had loved each other. I stood there calmly, letting her rant, letting her exhaust herself with rage, until finally I looked her in the eye and told her something that silenced her instantly: you destroyed yourself. I just refused to let you take me down with you. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, and for the first time, I saw her crack completely. She wasn't the smug woman who revealed her secret at the funeral anymore. She wasn't the liar who strutted into court convinced she would win. She was just a broken woman, stripped of her illusions, her lies, and her power. She turned and left without another word, and I knew in that moment that I had won, not just in court, not just in the eyes of others, but in the battle for my own dignity. Still, victory doesn't erase pain. I spent many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why my husband had let this go on for so long. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he allowed her to hold this power over both of us? I may never know the answers, and maybe that's the cruelest part of all. Betrayal leaves scars not just from the people who hurt you, but from the questions that can never be answered. But one thing I do know is this: I will never allow myself to be silent again. My sister thought she could bury me in shame, that she could strip me of everything and laugh as I crumbled. Instead, I rose from the ashes, and I made sure the world knew who she really was. That is the revenge she will never escape, the knowledge that her lies didn't define me, that they destroyed her instead. After that night when my sister stormed off from my doorstep, something inside me shifted. I no longer looked at her with the same fury that had consumed me at the beginning. Now, I looked at her with a kind of cold detachment, almost pity. She had burned every bridge she'd ever had, and though she tried desperately to climb out of the ashes, she only sank deeper with each frantic move. Word around town spread faster than fire on dry grass. People she once called friends stopped inviting her to gatherings. Parents didn't want their children around her because of the scandal, and slowly, she became an outcast. For years she had thrived on gossip, using whispers as her weapon. Now the whispers were knives turned against her. Meanwhile, I started to pick up the broken pieces of my own life. At first, it was small things. I went back to work after taking a leave, even though walking into that building made me feel like everyone's eyes were drilling into my back. The first day I walked in, silence fell, and I could almost hear the weight of their thoughts. But instead of shrinking, I lifted my head and smiled. I didn't need their approval anymore. I had my own strength now. To my surprise, people began approaching me, offering kindness, asking how I was doing. Some apologized outright for believing the lies, others awkwardly skirted around it, but I accepted their words with a grace I didn't even know I was capable of. Because deep down, I knew I had something they didn't, resilience. At home, my nephew, who I now thought of more like a son, began to find his footing too. He applied for college scholarships, started working part-time, and slowly, his anger turned into determination. He told me one night at dinner that he wanted to make something of himself, not in spite of his mother's lies, but because of them. He wanted to prove that her poison didn't define him, that he could rise above it. Hearing that from him lit something in me I hadn't felt in months: pride. I knew then that maybe the greatest revenge I could take wasn't just tearing my sister's lies apart, it was helping her own son become everything she tried to twist him away from. But of course, she didn't go quietly. My sister tried one last desperate move, filing another claim in court, this time arguing that she had been coerced when she confessed to me at the funeral. She tried to paint herself as the victim once more, saying grief had made her lose her mind, that she never meant what she said. But the problem with liars is that they forget their own stories. She contradicted herself so many times that the judge dismissed her claims before the case even went far. Watching her scramble, seeing the once confident, smug woman unravel in such a public way, was like watching justice carve itself into reality. Still, as much as I wanted to move forward, there were nights where grief still clawed at me. Losing my husband wasn't something I could just brush aside, even with the truth about his betrayal and her manipulation. I missed him. I missed the man I thought he was, the life we had built together, even if parts of it had been tainted by lies. Grief doesn't leave just because anger takes its place. Sometimes I would find myself crying on the floor, holding one of his old shirts, wondering if I had been blind, if I should have seen the signs. But then I would remember how she gloated at his funeral, how she held on to that secret for years just to destroy me, and I would rise again. My tears weren't weakness anymore, they were proof that I had survived something meant to break me. Months passed, and slowly, my life became mine again. I invested in myself, took up painting, something I had given up years ago when life got busy. I traveled to places I had only ever dreamed of visiting. I surrounded myself with people who truly cared for me, the kind who didn't need me to prove anything, who stood by me not because they pitied me, but because they respected me. And with each step forward, I felt my sister fading further into the background, like a ghost haunting her own mistakes. One day, I ran into her at the grocery store. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes carried that wild, desperate look I had seen the night she came to my door. She saw me and froze, the bag of apples in her hand shaking slightly. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered everything she had done, the lies, the humiliation, the cruelty, and I simply nodded at her and walked away. I didn't need to scream or fight anymore. My silence, my refusal to acknowledge her as a threat, was the loudest statement I could make. That's the thing people don't understand about revenge. It isn't always about destroying the other person with fire and fury. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is living well, showing them that their poison couldn't kill you, that you rose higher because of it. My sister expected me to be broken forever, to be buried in humiliation, but instead, I rebuilt my life into something stronger than she could ever touch. And that, I realized, was what truly burned her. I don't know what became of her after that. Rumors said she moved to another town, trying to start over, but people like her always carry their lies with them, like a shadow that never lets go. I stopped caring. For the first time in years, she wasn't the center of my thoughts anymore. I was. My healing was. My future was. And that was a kind of power I had never felt before. What I learned through all of this is that family betrayal cuts the deepest because it comes from the people you let closest to your heart. But it also teaches you the most powerful lessons about strength, trust, and resilience. My sister thought she had destroyed me, but instead, she became the very reason I learned to rise stronger. And when I look at myself now, I don't see the broken widow who was humiliated at her husband's funeral. I see a woman who was tested in fire and came out forged in steel. As the months turned into a year, I began to notice how different my life felt without the constant shadow of betrayal looming over me. The pain was still there, of course. Grief is a long, stubborn guest that doesn't leave just because you tell it to, but it had shifted into something softer, something I could live with instead of something that crushed me. My house, once so quiet it felt like a tomb, slowly came back to life. Laughter returned when my nephew and his friends gathered in the living room. The smell of fresh paint filled the rooms where I hung my own artwork. The garden bloomed again because I had finally found the energy to care for it. My life, piece by piece, was becoming mine again. But the thing about betrayal is that it never truly disappears. It lingers in the corners of your mind, reminding you of the scars left behind. Sometimes I would see couples holding hands in the park and feel a pang of bitterness. Sometimes I would dream of my husband, and when I woke up, the memory of both love and lies twisted together like a cruel knot in my chest. And yet, even in those moments, I reminded myself of something important: I had survived. I had faced the worst kind of humiliation, the most cutting kind of family betrayal, and I had not only endured, I had triumphed. The community that once mocked me now respected me. People looked at me not as the woman who was fooled, but as the woman who refused to stay silent, who stood tall even when she was broken inside. And slowly, I realized that the respect I had always wanted from others didn't matter as much as the respect I had gained for myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in the shadow of anyone, not my husband, not my sister, not even the town's opinions. I was living in my own light. There came a day when my nephew stood before me, acceptance letter in hand, tears shining in his eyes. He had been offered a full scholarship to a university hours away, the kind of opportunity that could change his entire future. When he hugged me, thanking me for standing by him, for giving him the truth even when it hurt, I felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. He was proof that my sister's lies hadn't won. He was proof that the truth, no matter how painful, can set someone free. The day he left for college, I stood on the porch waving as his car disappeared down the road, and I thought about how different things might have been if my sister's plan had worked. If she had succeeded, he would still be trapped in her web of lies, believing he was bound to a father who wasn't his, tied to a story that wasn't real. Instead, he was free, and so was I. That was the ultimate victory, the ultimate revenge, not just tearing her down, but building something good out of the ruin she tried to leave me in. And yet, sometimes I think back to the moment it all began, to the funeral, to her whispering that vile confession in my ear while my husband's casket was still warm in the ground. I think about how she smirked, how she gloated, how she thought she had destroyed me with a single sentence. She didn't realize then that what she had done wasn't the end of me. It was the beginning. The beginning of a woman who would no longer tolerate betrayal. The beginning of a woman who would no longer shrink into silence. The beginning of me standing in my own strength. Do I forgive her? People ask me that sometimes, as if forgiveness is the natural next step. And the truth is, no, I don't. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, and pretending otherwise would only cheapen the scars I carry. Forgiveness, in her case, would feel like letting her win, like erasing the pain she caused. I don't need forgiveness to move on. What I need is truth, dignity, and the life I've built without her poison. That's enough for me. Sometimes, I still see her in my dreams, the version of her from our childhood before all of this, when we used to sit on the porch steps and talk about our futures. Sometimes I wonder what twisted her into the person she became, what turned her love into envy, her sisterhood into betrayal. But then I wake up, and I remind myself that wondering won't change what she did. The past is the past, and I've learned that carrying her choices on my shoulders only weighs me down. I've laid that burden to rest, just as I laid my husband to rest. The truth is, betrayal doesn't just end when the betrayer is exposed. It lives in you, it shapes you, it forces you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that rebuilding doesn't have to mean becoming bitter or broken. Rebuilding can mean becoming stronger, clearer, and more determined than ever before. My sister revealed her secret at the worst possible moment, at my husband's funeral, thinking it would shatter me. But what she really did was give me a gift she never intended, the gift of clarity, the gift of knowing who I am when everything else is stripped away. And who am I? I am the woman who stood in front of a judge and exposed the truth. I am the woman who raised a boy into a man by giving him honesty instead of lies. I am the woman who walked into a grocery store and didn't flinch when my betrayer stood beside me. I am the woman who refused to be buried by shame, who turned her pain into fire, and who used that fire to forge herself into steel. So yes, my husband may be gone, my marriage may have been tainted by secrets I'll never fully understand, and my sister may have tried to destroy me. But in the end, I'm still standing, stronger than ever. And that is something she will never take away from me. Because revenge isn't always about ruining someone else's life, it's about reclaiming your own. And mine, after everything, is finally, beautifully, undeniably mine.